Rule of law is spoken by every people worldwide. Politicians talk about rule of law. Uh, Lawyers talk about rule of law. Doctors talk about rule of law. But they talk about this without being specific, without looking to its originality, without bringing the crucial meaning. What is the rule of law meaning? What does it mean? Everybody talk about the rule of law. What is the rule of law? Worldwide, citizens criticize their government that no, there have been violation or infringement of the rule of law. What does rule of law means? Rule of law, it was built by the father of rule of law, who was known as Professor Albert von Dicey, whereby in his book that was called Constitutional Law, Professor von Dicey wrote this book it was in 1885, whereby this book was built on the basis or on the views of natural law scholars. Natural scholars, we had scholars like Montesquieu. By this time, you should remember when by this time when rule of law came into existence by Professor von Dicey, there we had dictatorial governments. Some of history students will remember the governments in 1799 in France. So this was the time when these professors rose uh, to advocate for the rule of law, to advocate for separation of power, to advocate for representative government. Professor von Dicey, in his book, he pointed out to uh, he argued about the principle of the rule of law, whereby the rule of law it's the one that should govern in the country, whereby let the law rule and it be removed from the hands of the angry men, whereby by that time the hungry men ruling the monarchies, whereby for themselves they were the law. So Professor von Dicey came up with the solution in order to uh, rebut this, or in order to solve these issues or the problems that were in the monarchies before. Professor von Dicey came up with the three elements in the rule of law in his principle. The first element was about the absolute supremacy and dominance of the regular law as opposed to arbitrary exercise of individual power, whereby Professor in the first element was advocating for the arbitrary supremacy or and the dominance of the rule of law, meaning that the law itself, if it is in the country, it is the one that should rule. The law, it meant that nobody it was supposed to be above that law, whether it's a president, whether it's a king. So that was the first issue. It meant that if at all there have been supremacy of the law and dominance of the law, these people who had a lot of power, like the monarchies that existed before that I have told you, the law would prevail amongst that. Professor went ahead by advocating for equality, whereby that in order to have peaceful environment or in order to have the government based on the law, we should have the principle of equality. Everybody should be equal before the law in terms of whether the race, whether the color, whether the sex, we should be equal before the law. Because uh, by that time, it remember that it was we used to have the race whereby the kings and the queens could come from a specific race. So these people were wise men. They decided to come up with equality that everybody should be equal before the law. So Professor came up with many principles, and he came up with the last principle, which was all about an instrument of just government, whereby the just government meant that it meant the government that do not violate the rule of law, whereby that government that follow the law, whereby if we talk about justice, whereby justice is fulfilled in that country, where when justice must be guaranteed in that country. So Professor brought up those three principles in the elements of the principle of the rule of law. The first principle, supremacy of the law, or supremacy and dominance of the regular law and equality before the law, and the instrument of just government. However, given that there have been what we call the modification of these principles, modification and changing of these principles that they brought by Professor Von Dicey in 1885, whereby we had the modification and the changing of these uh, principles. Remember, in 1959, we had the International Coalition of Jurists that met in Geneva, and this was never changed the minds of Professor Von Dicey. But for them, they came up with certain principles. They formulated certain principles to add on what Professor Von Dicey left. How? The number one, the first principle in the meeting of Geneva uh, was the existence, that there should be the existence of a stronger government. This stronger government that we're talking to, they're not talking about a dictatorial government. They're talking about the government that is effective. How is it effective? In fulfilling the rights of the people. The government that do not violate the rule of law. The government that is following justice. That is the strong government. Another tenant or another principle that was brought up by ICJ in 1959, they talked about all government actions. They talk about the government actions. Which government actions that they talked to? Government action. They talked about like executive. They talked about legislature. They talked about judiciary. That these government actions should be backed up by the law. If we are talking about executive, the executive should be backed up by the law. It should not dominate it should not dominate the judiciary, it should not dominate the legislature. Another principle that was brought up was the principle of equality, whereby everybody should be you have to be equal before the law. Whether we are different in tribe, race, color, sex, we have to be equal before the law. Meaning that if at all somebody is going against that, you are violating the rule of law. Another one was about the independence of the judiciary. The judiciary should be independent. How it should be independent? The judiciary should not be subjected to under control by other organs. For example, the executive. The executive should not control the judiciary. The judges should be impartial. There should be discovery of what we call the tenure of the judges, or the salary of the judges. The judges must not be taxed their salaries. So this one maintains what we call the independence. It maintains the